At the end of the day, it's not about what you have or even what you've accomplished. It's about what you've done with those accomplishments. It's about who you've lifted up, who you've made better. It's about what you've given back. Denzel Washington. Welcome to Inspire Vision. Our sole purpose is to elevate the lives of others and to inspire you to do the same.
Katerina, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, so it's lovely to have you. Where are you from? Where are you at?
Right now, I'm calling from Spain, in Ibiza, Spain.
Wow.
Yeah.
What took you to Spain?
Good question. What took me to Spain? I lived here in 2013 and I loved it. I absolutely loved it. And then I left and lived in lots of different places. I lived in Dubai. I lived back in London. I went to Vancouver for 5 years and then came back to London, and I realized I didn't want to be in London. And so I knew I wanted to stay in Europe. And my husband and I were kind of debating, like, where do you want to go to now? Where do you want to go to? And we both were learning Spanish at the time, though I have to say I'm not really learning it right now, which is really bad. But we landed on Spain. And because I'd lived in this part of Spain before, I already had friends, I already had a network. And I figured, why not? Why not?
Wonderful. Well, I'd love for you to share with the audience who you are and really the story behind what you're doing now.
Sure. So my name is Katerina. I'm a high performance relationship coach and gender dynamic social scientist. So what that really means is that I work with a lot of high performers and I help them with their personal relationships. So specifically their love lives, their kind of love relationships. And then from a kind of background, academic background, it's in gender dynamics. So looking at masculinity, femininity, looking at the different genders and how they operate in relationships between them, and then kind of bringing the two together. So how I got into this is kind of a multi-pronged reason, but I had my own personal experience. So I've always been very kind of high performance, high achieving my whole life, and, you know, jumping through the hoops, trying to get the grades and climb the corporate ladder and all of that. And in my late 20s, I figured it was time to settle down and, you know, get married and have kids and blah, blah, blah. And I got engaged to my then boyfriend, and everything seemed picture perfect. Everything seemed like it was, you know, a really wonderful relationship. And yet at the same time, I felt like something was off. I wasn't convinced it was really the right thing for me, but I didn't want to let it go. I didn't want to walk away from something. There was so much fear around that. And after really 2 years of going back and forth, should I stay, should I go, doing marital counseling, seeing tons of therapists and working on myself, I did eventually decide to leave. In retrospect, that was a very long process. And there was a lot of kind of self-gaslighting that I did there, which I now see as a very common theme in virtually every high-achieving person that I work with. This real kind of lack of self-trust of what we know deep down to be true. And this desire to get things right, to achieve, to perform, to not have things kind of go wrong and kind of have that sunk cost happening. So that's really what got me to kind of focus on relationships specifically, because that's obviously been my personal story. From an academic perspective, it's gender dynamics, and from a professional perspective, my background's behavioral science. I was a regional vice president for a global behavioral science consultancy, doing a lot of consulting on people and how do you get people to be better at work, to be happier at work, and DE&I and all of that. And so really when that kind of evolved into coaching and I was looking to leave corporate, I trained to be a coach, trained to be an executive coach, realized a lot of executives were struggling with their relationships, put two and two together, and here I am.
Here you are. And, you know, it's interesting. You talk about high performance people and yet, you know, and this is what I've found as I've worked with small businesses, never in the corporate world like that. But what I would tell my people is, you know, well, the principles we're going to talk about here in business apply to life. And just so you're aware of that, and they found that that's very true. So as you talk about high performance people, obviously these are people that are going to really help you. But is there a difference, in your opinion, between high performance people and other people that are made not, quote, high performance relative to relationships?
Yeah, 100%. I think that the high performance kind of angle is really me doing that thing where, you know, I serve the person that I relate with the most. that's not saying that the issues in relationship that I solve for aren't almost universal problems, right? I think specifically with high performance, the things that I run into is I could probably drill down a lot even further and talk about high performance individuals who are, high achievers, who have an undercurrent of anxiety, who have probably been raised into high performing, high achieving families, who were maybe absent growing up. And so they had a lot of responsibility on their shoulders. And so they had to kind of mature very quickly. And because of that, they're very used to grinning and bearing it. I hear this a lot of the time. Like, do I just grin and bear my relationship? Do I just suck it up? Do I just roll my sleeves up and get it done? This kind of mentality of, I have to just get through this and I am responsible. I'm not going to do the irresponsible thing like walking away from my marriage or walking away from my long-term relationship. And so I think that's kind of why the high performance angle is very key, I think, to the people I work with. So I get it. I understand it. I've thought that way. I still sometimes do think that way as well. Plus, the burnout, the stress, the anxiety from working 60+ hour weeks, from having a lot of pressure, from having a lot of financial pressure, and all of these different things. It's a whole cocktail of challenges for your love life, really. I don't know if I could fully kind of relate to someone who maybe, works a 30-hour week and doesn't have the pressure of having to be on a plane frequently or having to work long hours and feel disconnected from their partner. I'm sure the issues are very similar. It's just a different kind of context, if that makes sense.
Well, yeah, and just who you're more familiar with, which is fine. And quite frankly, I think that, based on my experience, what we're going to talk about today is certainly pertinent to anyone. You say they're only working 30 hours. There's a lot of people that are working a lot of time, not making a lot of money, and going through this very same stuff. So from a behavioral standpoint, as you say, you have a background in behavioral sciences. Do you find that high-performing people kind of have a very similar personality when we get into that? I'm familiar with, and I don't know if you are, with the DISC, D-I-S-C, personality behavioral profiling. And, when I think about high profile, I think about those left brain people who are really focused, extroverts and so forth. Do you find that there is a personality profile that fits into this, quote, high performance modality?
It's a really good question and one I've been grappling with. And I think that there is, and yet I also wonder if the people that feel called and drawn to work with me are a specific type of person, right? Because there's a lot of variations of high performer. I'm sure Elon Musk was a high performer. I don't think I'd want to work with him, nor do I think he'd probably want to work with me, because I think our values would be very misaligned, right? But at the same time, the personality traits and kind of the qualities might be quite similar. So I think there are. I think what I see a lot of with at least my clients and the people that I work with is this undercurrent, this kind of low-level anxiety. I see that consistently, where they might not even be aware of it, but someone might call out like, oh, you're very type A, you're a bit highly strung, or a little bit anxious, you always get stressed, you overthink things, maybe you ruminate. These kind of patterns I see very consistently. And I bring everything back to kind of the root cause, and I look at from a kind of psychological perspective, or where did this all come from? And why is it that you have this anxiety and this propensity to kind of overthink, and yet you're a high achiever? They go hand in hand, right? The root cause is kind of the same. But I'm sure there's lots of different variations of it. That makes sense.
Well, it does. And, as you talk about the root cause, and I love that whole phrase, because I think so many times people, I see people go into therapy, as you talked about, and so forth. And a lot of times it's talk therapy. They never get to the root cause. They never do. And, I had that same experience. I had that same experience when I had my dental practice. Was, people would come in, and I had a little subspecialty in temporomandibular joint disorder. And so people would come in and say, oh, I have TMJ. And I'm going, no, you have two. You have one on the right and one on the left. So now tell me, what are your problems? Your symptoms. And then we would get into that whole thing and find out that, it has nothing to do with anything other than a neuromuscular situation that we could deal with. And so I love how you talk about that. But as you have experienced people who are, quote, high achievers, whatever that personality happens to be. Do you find that there are similar imprints within their lives that literally are affecting and self-sabotaging and those type of things? And if so, what are they and how do they come about?
Yeah, again, a very good question. The main kind of, I'll keep it really simple, because I don't want to get too deep into the weeds of psychology here, but very high level, and definitely the story that was for me, is imagine you're a baby, you're born, you've got your parents, they're busy working, they're busy providing, they're busy trying to build a great life for you. Inevitably, they're going to be very preoccupied, right? It's just kind of the way of the world that we have these days. They're going to be preoccupied. And often you might have a nanny, but they might just be pretty absent. It's not a conscious thing. They're not doing it deliberately, but they're busy, right? They are literally preoccupied. And in that vein, they are becoming emotionally absent to you as a child. As a child, what we know is that between the ages of 0 and 8, your brain is very spongy and susceptible to everything that it receives. And you're not fully conscious. You're not fully able to kind of make your own judgments or your own kind of rational opinions about things because you're a baby. You're 0 to 8 years old. You're a tiny little thing. And so the experience of, well, my parents are really busy, my parents are absent, or my father's traveling. That was my case. My father was on a plane. He was an international consultant, like in McKinsey style. So he was on a plane half the time. And so he's absent. And so the little kid's interpretation is going to be something around, well, the parent's not here. They're not responding to my cries. They're not helping me here. There's got to be something wrong with me, probably. I've probably done something bad. Or I'm flawed. I'm broken. I'm defected. And classically, I'm not good enough, right? This belief of clearly there's something with me. We personalize everything. And this trend of personalizing a lot of what our parents do to us continues well through to adult age. I remember when I was 23, when my parents got a divorce, I immediately internalized it as like, must be my fault somehow. Of course, it wasn't anything to do with me, but it's this kind of very childlike response that we go into, right? And that's very much from the core wound place. So this child will internalize this feeling or this experience of there must be something wrong with me. I must be defected or I'm just not good enough. And that becomes the core wound. And that core wound then begins to fuel a lot of the behavior that kid goes on to exhibit. What it does as a core wound is it really creates a belief, an internal belief inside that child. And what we know about the human brain is if you believe something, it's going to have to be true on the outside because your brain needs congruence, right? So if you believe something, it's going to work very, very hard to recreate that reality on the outside. That's kind of how law of attraction works. And so if you think about this belief of, well, I'm not good enough, what's that going to do to the child? It's going to make them not believe that they're good enough. So they're going to work extremely hard to prove that they are actually good enough. Or they're going to self-sabotage to go the other way and just believe that they really are no good. And it's not even worth doing anything because maybe they have another belief of everything's worthless. I'm worthless. But with high achievers, what I see a lot of is this kind of fuel, this urgency to prove themselves. And I'm pretty confident most high achievers probably wouldn't even resonate with this when I'm saying it. I know I certainly didn't. I was like, well, what's she talking about? Like I'm not like that at all. I work hard. I'm ambitious because I love it. I love working 70-hour weeks. I love like all of this stuff. But it is a fuel. It's a fuel coming from this kind of internal sense of lack, of not being enough, of not having enough and having to do more, of having to prove more, of having to work harder, of having to earn more. And that is what fuels this kind of high achiever mentality, at least one kind of thread of it. And that is where we get a lot of high achievers from. And I hold up my hand because that's definitely what fueled me.
Well, and as you explain that, what comes to my mind is a lot of people experience that. And, what I look at is, do they have a higher achiever mentality, but may not necessarily, according to the world and social society, be high achievers, and yet because they're self-sabotaging, they're literally, as you say, on that other side, I'm not good enough, and so they continue to prove themselves that they're not good enough. So, quote, from a societal standpoint, they're not high achievers, but from a emotional, mental standpoint, growing up as children, thinking I'm not good enough for whatever reason that happens to be. They are experiencing the same self-sabotage.
100%. And that self-sabotage, like you just said, it can show up in so many different ways, right? Even the person who is high achieving, ostensibly performing well in society, and maybe they've made their millions and they're living in their big mansion, they can still be self-sabotaging. Their relationships could be going down the drain. That's kind of what I specialize in, right? That there's a belief that I'm not good enough to have a healthy, secure, meaningful, loving relationship. I'm not good enough to just be. No one's going to love me for just being me. And so the self-sabotage there is not believing that I'm worthy or enough to have a healthy relationship. So I'm surrounding myself by possessions and going on holiday and all these experiences, getting quick dopamine hits, because I don't believe that I'm good enough to have a loving relationship just existing as a human being, right? So I think that self-sabotage can really show up in so many different ways, including the way of just not achieving in society and actually being more kind of classical self-sabotage, procrastination, avoidance, all of these different things.
Well, and I think we all observe some of these extremely successful high achievers and think, oh, I want a life like that. But as you work with them, and as we talk about possessions and ego and all of that, do we really want to be like them and have the same challenges? Or is there a different approach that can help us to become more whole, less self-sabotaging and happier, and learning how to find a really great relationship and keep a great relationship?
Yeah, exactly.
So from that perspective, why are relationships so important? I mean, I know the answer to this, but I want you to talk about it a little bit.
Yeah.
Why are relationships so important in people's lives? And how does that ultimately affect them from a standpoint of living a fulfilling life?
Yeah. And it's an important question that might have like an obvious answer, but I think I'm going to give a not so obvious answer to this. And that is, when I set out to do relationship coaching, my end goal was never actually, I'm going to help people get into relationships. It was never actually about that. It was more about, and this is what I originally kind of started out as, was helping people build healthy relationships with themselves, recognizing that when you don't have a healthy relationship with yourself, you really have nothing. You are operating on a very shaky foundation, because everything that you go out there to build, all the wealth you accrue, the career that you build, whatever it is, it's not rooted in a stable core, that stable relationship with yourself. It's shaky. And so when I started out with relationship coaching, that's what I wanted to do, was to help people build a relationship with themselves. What I realized was people didn't really care about this, right? Because it's kind of framed as like self-love. And I'm doing quotation marks because it's such an overused phrase. It's very widely misunderstood. And it's so kind of woo-woo and cliche and fluffy. But actually, self-love is the most important thing that we can do, because that is really how you become securely attached. It's how you develop a healthy self-esteem. It's how you develop healthy self-actualization, autonomy, agency, all those really important things, confidence, blah, blah, blah. But like, people don't want to talk about self-love. And so when I was thinking about, okay, well, what's an outcome or a kind of side effect of having a healthy relationship with yourself? It's actually having healthy relationships. Because only when you have a healthy relationship with yourself can you have healthy relationships with others. And when you have healthy relationships with others, you actually develop an even healthier relationship with yourself. That's kind of one thing. The second thing that I realized, though, was that in order to develop a healthy relationship with yourself, it's not enough to do personal development and just work on yourself in a silo. Because humans are relational beings. We are wired for connection. And the fact that your low self-esteem, your core wounds, your inner kind of trappings, your inner self-sabotage stems from your first relationships, your relationships with your primary caregivers, tells us that if we want to go back and do the work on you and heal your relationship with yourself, we've got to look at your relationship with other people, right? So the relationships you have are almost kind of the conduit to getting you to having that self-esteem, that confidence, all the really amazing things that people spend their lives pursuing. And now the thing is, you can try and meditate your way to it. You can do psychedelics. You can, see a therapist for 15 years like I did. You can do whatever you want to do working on yourself, but it's not going to do the trick until you start looking at yourself in relation to others, because it's other people that are the mirror to how you attach to yourself. It's kind of a very meta response there, but does that make sense?
Well, it does. And and I think, as you say, if we are only focusing on ourselves, you know, a relationship with ourselves, that can never be as accurate as we observe our relationships with others.
Absolutely.
And hopefully those relationships, whether they end up continuing on, whether they're friendships or romantic relationships or even relationships with family members, as we look at that, you're right. Then all of a sudden we have a contrast of what's going on. And then I love the fact that then you start to do that internal looking and saying, why is this relationship so great? Why did this relationship not work out?
Right. Because this is the thing, right? I remember having so many friends. And again, I fell into this trap too of thinking, I've been in therapy for a long time. You know, I know myself inside out. I journal, I meditate. I'll be fine. I can get into a relationship and I'll figure it out because I feel very healthy and solid and stable within myself. But it's easy to feel healthy and stable and solid within yourself. It's very easy when you're on your own. It's incredibly difficult when you're in a relationship with someone who has the potential to be your soulmate and is going to trigger the heck out of you, because that's what relationships do, right? Because we are relational beings. So the work has to be relational if we really want to grow, which is why I think it's the most important work that we can be doing for ourselves.
Well, and you talk about those triggers, and you know it's so fascinating. I've experienced this in my life. You know, I have 4 kids, and I happen to be a high D, so I'm strong personality. I wouldn't say I'm a necessarily high achiever, though I grew up in a family that kind of demanded that. But
by the way, I don't think any high achievers think they're high achievers, to be clear. Like, no one does. No one does. Everyone's like, oh no, I barely work. I could be so much better. So yeah.
But what I find is it's so interesting that I can say something to my kids and be coming from a point of, I'm your father and I really want to be able to be there to help you. And yet their perception, for whatever reason, is I'm criticizing. And therefore I see these triggers come up, and I experience the same thing for myself. How do we, number one, how do we recognize that we have those triggers? And number two, how do we then start to work on those and start to minimize, I would like to say eliminate, but at least minimize those triggers so that they're not affecting our relationships? And obviously, as you said, we observe that in our relationships, but there still has to be that individual work.
Yeah. Such a good point. The triggers are really indicators of where we need to be leaning in to do that inner work, right? I always kind of say that, at least with my clients when we work together, that the trigger becomes a good thing, because in the end, the trigger is pointing you to where you need to go inward and where you need to do some clearing and some healing and self-soothing and all of the brilliant practices that we have up our sleeves to heal that trigger. And they're not something to run from. They're not something to avoid, to numb out from. And really, the main vehicle for resolving triggers is going to be to learn to go inward and to learn what I call to dialogue with that trigger, to really begin to understand, like, where is it coming from? What does it need? What would it look like to have a different manifestation of whatever the trigger is trying to get from you? Because typically there's going to be an unconscious need that's trying to get met, right? So it's this kind of inner inquiry process that ultimately, it doesn't need you to be in therapy. It doesn't need you to be working with a coach for years on end. It's something that you learn once, you practice it, you learn to embody it, and then you have that self-mastery. You can go ahead and you'll be triggered until the end of your days, probably, right? We're all going to be triggered. It's part of the human condition. But it's like this kind of onion layer where you're constantly peeling away the different layers of triggers to get more and more clear to that kind of core, that kernel of who you are.
And as we do that, you talk about meditation kind of in a negative aspect.
Oh, no, I'm a meditation teacher. I love meditation, Dorian.
Oh, okay. I was going to say, I do too. I try to meditate every day.
No, I love
a lot of times for walking meditation. But it's interesting what you were saying, because as I was walking the other day and thinking about, and I use solfeggio frequencies that I listen to. as I'm doing that. And obviously one is of the heart. And so I'm thinking to myself, and that's where you really struck a note, I need to have more self-love. I need to be able to love myself, so on and so forth. So let's talk about how can an individual, with what you have just explained, use meditation to be able to confront those triggers and to be able to work through them so that they're not being as deeply affected as they have been in the past.
Yeah. And this is why meditation is super powerful, right? I'll never forget when I called off my first engagement, I was going through my mindfulness-based stress reduction teacher training. So I was actually training to be a mindfulness teacher. And it was the perfect timing because I was going through absolute hell of just grief and despair and my whole world collapsing. But I had to sit through 8 hours of essentially meditation teacher training, which you can imagine is like 3 hours of meditation here, an hour of meditation here, like all day, every day.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it was intense, but it was so powerful to just go inward and be with myself and, kind of go through that pain and come out the other side. Of course, there were waves of it. It went on for months, but it was still such a helpful tool. And I do believe that I actually healed from that breakup much faster with that tool than had I just, drunk and gone out or whatever, rebounded. Not that I didn't try to do that as well, but you understand that meditation is very pivotal. So what I always tell my clients is, even if you don't like meditating, even if you don't like sitting still and observing your thoughts for 20, 30 minutes, you can learn to start to observe the sensations in your body and start to observe, where does the trigger live? Because it's going to live somewhere, right? It's going to live,
Yes.
It's going to be trapped somewhere in the body. I'm big on somatics. So where is it living in the body? How does it feel in the body? And this is already kind of starting to go inward into that process to connect with it. And then once you're connecting with it, you can start to build that internal dialogue of soothing it, of understanding it, of unpacking what's going on for it. Whose voice even is it? How old is that voice? Where is it coming from? And as you it's like you're being an inspector and you're just going through with a magnifying glass, trying to drill down into that trigger in order to give it more space, in order to let it speak. Because when we give something space and let it speak, it says what it has to say, and then it tends to calm down, right? It's when we're numbing it out and repressing it and avoiding it that it starts to scream.
Well, and what you're talking about reminds me of NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, because, to me, that very thing of finding out where's the pain located and then going back and discovering where did you experience that as a child and then going in and reframing it. That's what you're really saying. So what you're saying, though, is people can do that on their own through a meditative process.
Yes.
But you talk about mindfulness. Okay. And I think for people to understand that's a word, again, that's being thrown around all over the place.
Yeah.
But what is mindfulness and why is it so important that we seek to achieve mindfulness?
Why is it important? Because life is passing us by. And if we're not mindful of it, then what are we even doing? Right. Really, it's about, I'm going to go back again to my own personal example. Like, I remember when I was in such a hellish place, falling off that engagement, being in the depths of grief and despair, the more that I was able to become mindful of my own experience and be with my own experience and go inward, the better I felt, the safer I felt, until eventually I got to this place where I was kind of cocooning in myself and just hanging out there, literally being embodied, which is something I always tried to achieve before rationally and tried to study embodiment, learn the process of embodiment. But it was actually through pain that I started to be more embodied and be with myself, because there's nothing else really there for me to do. And that's when I found peacefulness. That's when I found kind of bliss, just living moment to moment, second to second, being just in my body and being aware of all the sensations of the experience of living. Because I realized that there's nothing to worry about. I'm here and I'm alive and I'm breathing and I'm safe, and that's kind of really it. And the kind of the beauty of the world would expand to me and open up. And I just remember having these moments of feeling very at peace after so many years of not feeling at peace. And this is in, in the depths of something really awful, having to call off my wedding and like terrible things happening. But there was nothing else to do but to go inward. It was too scary to be outward. And that's when I discovered, I'd been meditating for about 10 years by this point, but that's when I discovered a whole new level of meditative depth. And I really felt the peacefulness and the clarity that can come from it.
Well, and I think that's the goal of everyone in their lives, regardless of the relationships. That's what they really are trying to achieve. And we talk about mindfulness, we talk about a higher consciousness. I mean, the reality is, if I'm understanding you, we need to be aware of what's going on in our lives and why we are experiencing. I think there's so many people that have become victims in their own lives because they're not consciously aware, they're not mindful, and they're not actually doing that type of focus on why am I experiencing this, and what are those triggers that I'm trying to avoid, which is basically attracting the very thing I'm trying to avoid.
Exactly.
So as you work with people, how many times do you find people that are telling you, it's too late? I mean, I've been through relationships, they just haven't worked. And I feel like now it's a little bit too late.
Yeah, I do hear that a lot. Needless to say, a lot of these people don't work with me, right? I'll kind of discover this. There'll be a moment of curiosity. We'll jump on a call. We have a lovely conversation. And then I kind of begin to feel this disheartenment, this like kind of defeated sense. And when I drill down into it, it really is a belief that it's not going to happen for me. It's not going to happen for me. Often it's people who are kind of 45 plus, and that actually with some women it's even younger. I would say it's like 42 plus. And it's this belief of just like, it's not going to happen. And I'm best off either just enjoying my life, which looks like having short-term flings and going on a holiday. I keep hearing that, like people going on a holiday as if it's going to solve their problems, and having short-term flings and going on holidays and just making a lot of money and being single versus, just fully giving up and being quite sad about it. And I see it more in women, which I find really sad. I find that really, really sad. Some of my best clients have been men in their 50s who have refused to give up. And they've been like, nope, I'm going to figure this out. I don't want to die alone. And they roll their sleeves up, and they might never have done any therapy. They might never have done any coaching from the voice game. And they lean in and they show up and they do the work, and they get into a relationship. We get into an amazing relationship. Like 3 months later, one of my clients did. Or they're trying to improve their marriage, because I work with a lot of people in relationship as well. And they're often deciding, should they stay or should they go? And they're not prepared to settle and tolerate crumbs. But there are certainly people who are prepared to settle and not do anything, which I find so sad.
And how do people end up in bad relationships? I have another question for you. As you talked about men versus the women, do you find that as you get older, because that becomes a challenge, as you're getting older, you're obviously getting more set in your ways, but do you find that there's a mentality, a state that occurs as you get older that actually makes it more difficult for you to either be a good companion or to find a good companion?
Yeah, to me, it's all an inner belief system bit of work. If you are, and again, I definitely see this more in women, if you are believing that it's not going to happen for you, or there are no good men left, or there are no good people left. And I think the reason it happens more for women is because I think women, unfortunately, and I can totally relate to this, have been conditioned to believe of their love life as a timeline, right? You're perfect and ripe in your 20s, and in your early 30s, you're a prime catch. By your mid 30s, time is ticking. If you want to have kids, by your late 30s, oof, you're probably past it. In your 40s, good luck. I hear that from men telling me about that women. I hear that from men. I think it's absolutely disgusting and awful and so sad. At the same time, we can't deny that I think it does actually condition a lot of the mentality around, am I going to find healthy love at this point? Probably not, which is complete nonsense. We know that's statistically not true. We know that if you believe that you won't, well, then you won't. But if you believe that you can and you are worthy of it, even just a little bit, and you have even just a little bit of desire, and you're willing to put the work in, which doesn't have to be that much work. I tell my clients, like 3 to 6 months, that's it, of prioritizing your love life. And you can transform everything completely. You can. But it's that self-belief. What I see with men is that because men don't have that biological timeline or that kind of societal pressure, and often actually the societal narrative with men is that they get better with age. So I do see that a lot, right?
Right.
Terrible.
I'd like to think that.
Terrible. And so I see a lot more kind of hope and confidence with a lot of the men. But that also can come with a little naivety. I've worked with plenty of men in their 40s and 50s who think that, they're the bee's knees and they can get a 20-year-old and they're out there trying to date 20-year-olds. And I'm like, you're looking for a life partner. You're looking for a wife. You're looking for someone who's going to be an equal. What are you doing? No.
Well,
So,
yeah.
yeah.
And sometimes, I mean, I observe, and I like your differentiation. I observe so many times, particularly on Facebook, I have a lot of friends. It's interesting to see the women who get together and go on cruises together. They get together and, they go to this and that together, and they're always showing pictures of themselves in their group. I don't see that very often from men. But I definitely see that from the women. And are they developing a mental state to where they're not ever going to find that relationship because they're just finding they're just going to be with their girlfriends?
Yeah. I think a lot of it is going to be societal pushback, right? Because women have been incredibly oppressed for so long. And there's been such a lack of freedom. And there's been so much bad behavior in relationship. I mean, women couldn't have credit cards until the 70s, like rape in marriage was legalized, and there's so much horrible stuff. So I do believe that there's kind of this reclamation of freedom, but I think I think the energy it can come from is a wounded energy. It's an energy of defeat. It's an energy of, well, screw everyone else. I'm going to just do my own thing, which isn't coming from a place of, I deeply love myself and I want myself to have the best life that I can, which very likely would involve having someone who deeply loves me. Right? That's a much more vulnerable energy, which I think can be quite scary to lean into, especially when the narrative around is there are no good men left. All the men are, cheats or whatever it might be.
Well, and for those that do, why do some people compromise and find themselves consistently in a wrong relationship? And they may get out of it and find exactly the same thing again. What is this about compromising ourselves and allowing ourselves to get into those wrong relationships?
Yeah, great question. It's back to that core wound, right? So everything that I do, and my clients will probably be sick of me talking about this, so everything that I do is all about take it back to the core wounds, clear them out at the core wound place. Again, I love therapy, but I did 15 years of that and God knows how much money I spent. Don't know how far it got me, right? Just talking up here. It's all about going to the core, to the root, like you said. And so when we think about patterns of behavior, like repeatedly ending up in relationships where you end up getting cheated on, repeatedly ending up in relationships where you feel put on a pedestal by somebody else, repeatedly ending up in relationships where you don't feel safe, you don't trust your partner, or your partner is like distant or, breadcrumbing you and like leaving you breadcrumbs and you have to really fight for more love. These are all patterns, and the patterns come from the wounds. And we really have to drill down into what is the core wound, what are the beliefs, and what kind of identity has been formed on an unconscious level, not conscious, but unconscious level, that we then need to be dismantling and kind of upgrading or leveling up, whatever you want to call it, and clearing out the junk, the kind of the self-sabotage that's creating this attraction to the patterns and creating the patterns to be attracted to you. Because ultimately it's all happening on an unconscious level. You can try again, talk about it consciously. You can journal about it. You can, rant to your friends and go to singles events and try to change the pattern and look for someone better. But if you haven't dealt with it on an unconscious level, on a core root wound level, it's not going to work. Why? Because your unconscious mind is 95 to 97% of your brain. It's like physically impossible to try to consciously control your unconscious mind. It doesn't work.
And, you talk about individuals that have established, quote, a self-love. They love themselves. I can be on my own. And, and I do that once in a while because I realize, as you said, there has to be that foundation of self-love in order to be there for a relationship. But at the same time, there's so many people that stay in that self-love and I don't need a relationship and so forth. What have you found? What does a good relationship do for an individual that has really developed that personal self-love in a healthy way? What does a relationship do? How does it bring them to a higher level of peace and joy that they would not experience as an individual that is just good on their own?
Yeah, there's two things. Well, there's obviously more than two things it does. It does many wonderful things, but kind of two things on a large scale level. It does healing and it creates safety, right? Like on the one hand, most of us have wounds that need healing. I mean, again, it's part of the human condition. If you have an ego, you've got wounds, basically. And most of us feel deeply unsafe in our bodies, in where we are in the world. We won't be aware of it consciously, but there's going to be this kind of lack of safety. And so being in relationship, feeling connected, feeling loved, feeling chosen, feeling safe with someone, feeling trustful of someone creates deep nervous system safety, especially if they are on a similar page and they're also kind of, they've done their inner work and you're able to kind of co-regulate your nervous systems together. And all of the lovely hormones, the cocktail of wonderful hormones that come from that intimacy creates a lot of safety in the body, which is just a really wonderful, nourishing place to be. And it's very healing. And then the healing aspect of it, there's going to be triggers in the person that you love. That's just how it works. The person who you are most drawn to from a kind of safe perspective, not like a trauma bond or a toxic relationship, but a healthy, safe, loving connection, they're going to be triggering you. Why? Because that is just kind of the beauty on an unconscious level of the people that we're drawn to, the people who are good for us, because they're going to bring out a lot of those core wounds that need to be looked at. But because you feel safe in the container of that relationship, you're going to have the capacity to look at them and to do the healing with them. So you get to go even deeper in your healing. When we're alone, not only do we not really see a lot of our triggers because there's no one out there triggering us, but we also often don't actually feel safe to look at certain things. It's when you're in relationship with someone that you deeply love and deeply loves you back that you can have that healthy bit of trigger. I'm not talking about like screaming at each other and throwing pots and pans, but just healthy little like bubbles of trigger that you can then look at together and you can feel safe looking at it. You can feel safe doing the healing there. And so the evolution is so much greater. There's a saying by one of my favorite, I don't even know if he's a philosopher or psychologist, but he always says like, stage one of healing is when you're alone. The rest of all the healing happens when you're in relationship, because it's really in that union that you can go so much deeper. And we know that life is better when you've gone deeper. It just is, because you're carrying less baggage. It's all a process of freeing yourself.
And when you're in that ideal relationship, life is better.
Yeah.
I don't think we're meant to be alone.
No.
Whatever that happens to be. So as we come to a close, well, I have one more question before we do this. Mm-hmm. You talked about coaching versus, quote, talk therapy. What is the difference? And if someone is really wanting to get some help, because as I know, it's okay to try to do it all on your own, but there are times that you just can't. And as you said, you went through 15 years of therapy with not much help. What is the difference between an intelligent, well-versed coach and going through talk therapy?
Yeah, and that's a really valuable question, because they're both important, right? I always think of it as, I follow the COM-B model of behavioral change. You need to have the motivation, you need to have the capabilities, and you need to have the opportunity to actually change, right? And so what therapy is really good for is actually creating the motivation. Therapy is really great for building up awareness, helping you see and understand where your triggers are, where the problems are, where maybe even some of the core wounds are, helping you kind of like bring that magnifying glass and just take a deeper look and see the things that need to be looked at. And it builds up your motivation to actually change it, hopefully, because you see the impact it's having on your life. What it's not great for is capability building. Often it's like we kind of stop at the awareness level. You might learn a couple of tools and techniques, but you're not going to get the mass kind of capability building of, well, how do I clear out the core wounds? How do I work with my unconscious mind? Because therapy doesn't typically work with unconscious mind stuff. That's more of the coaching territory. How do I clear up the core wounds? How do I work with the unconscious mind? How do I actually build and drive the new capabilities of like learning how to communicate, of learning how to set proper boundaries, of learning how to, again, kind of manage my maladaptive behavioral responses? How do I actually stop a trigger in its tracks? All of these much more practical, action-orientated things aren't in the realm of therapy. Therapy is typically retrospective. It's like looking into the past, understanding it, making sense of it, and then you come into the present and it's like, well, what now? And that's where coaching kicks in, because coaching is all about the present and looking to the future, setting goals, building a process to get to that goal, building a strategy, and learning the capabilities that you need to create the opportunities to have what you want to have in life. So they go hand in hand.
I love that. And the one thing that we haven't talked about, and I know you really focus on, is the 3 phases process, that's based on behavioral science. So as we close and as you talk to the audience in a very short time, what are those three phase processes? And if you could share with the audience so that they could kind of get a sense of what they need to do and the direction they need to go.
Yeah, absolutely. So the 3 phases are really 3 phases that I came up with on the back of, being in that first engagement, deciding, do I stay, do I go, doing all that inner work, landing on the clarity and the certainty that I needed to actually exit. And then 11 months later, meet my husband, because it was a very fast process for me. And it's even faster now. But those 3 phases, amalgamating a bit of therapy, are really phase 1 is the, my brain's completely fried right now.
Self-sabotage.
It's not the self-sabotage. My brain has completely died in my own process. Phase 2, I'll just get to phase 2. Phase 2 is the behavioral science piece. So it's where you're actually, first phase is you're building the awareness. Like I just said in therapy, it's building that awareness. It's getting the clarity on like, what are the different patterns? How can you actually clear them out at the root phase and get rid of them, right? Because we have to do that. And so whilst I'm not a therapist and I never plan to sit there digging into people's lives and going into the nooks and crannies of all the stories, I don't actually believe it's very helpful to look at the stories. It's much more helpful to look at what are the core wounds and how do we clear those out? And how does the self-sabotage manifest? So that's the first phase, really like clearing all of that out. Phase 2 is the behavioral science phase, which is really all about, well, now that I've cleared all of that out and I can see more clearly, what does it actually want and need in my life and in my relationship to be actually happy long-term? Most people don't know. They know what they want. They want, a multimillionaire who's 6'3". Great. That's not what you actually need though.
Yes.
Right. There's a lot of egotistical proxies that we've been conditioned into thinking that we want: the big house, the lifestyle, blah, 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 the Ivy League education. These are all nice things, but again, they have no indicator on how happy you're actually going to be with that person long term. What you actually need is very different. And so you can't typically see what you need or connect with what you need when you're full of your own blockers and your self-sabotage. So you have to clear that out first. And then you come to getting clear on what it is that you want to need. Once you're clear on what you want to need, and you've got that clarity, then you can move to phase 3, the integrity phase, which is how do you build your life to get into greater integrity with that? So what that might look like is building a bit of a strategy to get your needs met. It might look like reevaluating your relationship and learning how to communicate better and communicate for your needs and communicate your boundaries. It might look like taking a step back and doing a bit of a life audit and shuffling things around so that you're living your best life now. But really the third phase is taking action on what you know now to be true about yourself, having cleared out all of that self-sabotage and junk. And that's where the self-trust is really built. That's where we really kind of build that self-actualization, that self-esteem. And in that process, clearing out all of that rubbish that's holding you back, getting very clear, putting your life into integrity, you are going to attract the right relationship for you, whether you're in a relationship or looking for a relationship, so much faster. Because if you know anything about, law of attraction or how any of this stuff works, from a behavioral science point of view, you are clear to actually get out there and align with it, to attract it. It's not woo-woo, it's science.
I know. I love that. So How do people find you? If they want to reach out to you and get some help, how do they find you?
Yeah, absolutely. So www.katerinapolonska.com is my website. And on there, I have a free masterclass where I walk through this methodology and just how it works on a more kind of tangible, granular level. And I also talk about the common pitfalls people fall into. So I highly recommend going there. You can also find me on Instagram at Katerina Polonska and just drop me a DM because I love to connect with people.
Okay. Yes. Thank you so much for being on the show. This has been fascinating, and I think that people are going to really get this, and I hope that they'll go to your website, because particularly as we talk about those 3 phases, and you took some time to do that. Those 3 phases, I think, really give you the methodology of being able to get to the point where you have a good relationship.
Yes, exactly.
All right. Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. And folks, thanks for listening. Hope you really enjoyed it. And we look forward to having you join us again soon. This is Dr. Doug saying namaste.